Welcome everybody to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos, whoever you are, wherever you are in your life's journey, whatever you believe and whoever you love, you are welcome here. My name is James Carroll, adult religious education instructor at the Unitarian Church. Today is Biblical Scholarship and Literacy lecture number 35, which is crazy that it took me 35 to get to Ruth. And today we're talking about Ruth. I want to remind everyone we do have a class webpage. The URL is long, I apologize. Sites.google.com, view Biblical Scholarship and Literacy. And for those who don't want to type all that, there's a nice QR code you can take a picture of. I try to keep on the webpage links to all these. I remind everyone they're recorded. I get a lot more people watching online, in fact, sometimes than there are in person. So that's great. And so I have links to these recordings, sometimes to my slides, depending on copyright issues. The threshold for using something in a lecture is different than the threshold for sharing it publicly. Sometimes I share my slides. I always share if there's handouts there and the list of suggested additional readings. I'll put links to those on the webpage as well. Last time we were here, we talked about the book of Judges. It took us 2 classes to get through that. And you remember we ended the book of Judges with the story of Samson and Delilah and the prophetess Deborah. So it's 2 stories with very powerful women characters and one absolutely crazy male character. If you remember that story. Both woman crazy and just kind of off the hinge revenge crazy. But today we get to talk about Ruth. And I wanted to say Ruth, I don't know how to introduce this subject right, but Ruth is, I think, one of the most beautiful stories, not just in the biblical text, but just in the ancient world. And I want to encourage people who maybe aren't big fans of the Bible to take this story as a standalone. And just recognize, if we had this story from the tablets in Babylon or something, it would be a classic of literature. And so maybe we can take it on its own merits and just look at the text for what it is and for its message, which is absolutely, I think, in many ways lovely. So let me see if I can tell you the tale of Ruth. I'll tell you the overview of the story in case you've never heard it before. Then we're going to dive into some questions like authorship and the purpose it was written and some of the themes and that sort of stuff. And then we will read the story. But I need to, before I can explain the themes, you need to know the story at least to some degree. And before we can read it together, you need to know the themes. So the book of Ruth is a story of 3 widows. One widow, the first, Naomi, travels to Moab because of a famine, takes her husband and 2 sons with her. The 2 sons marry Moabite women while in the land of Moab, and then they die. And her husband dies. And so she is destitute financially as well as bereft from family-wise, and she starts to head home. And her 2 daughter-in-laws attempt to go with her. She tries to send them back. One of them does go back. The other, named Ruth, goes with her. And when they get back to Israel, they are again destitute. And so Ruth goes off to harvest in the fields, what we call gleaning, which is to walk behind the harvesters and pick up all the stuff they missed, or to take stuff from the corners or the edges of the field, which they were commanded to leave behind for the widows and the orphans. This is the only way they could take care of themselves, not being allowed to own land themselves. And they meet Naomi's next of kin. Naomi's husband's next of kin, who actually has the right and the obligation, in fact, under Jewish law, to marry into the family and produce heirs who would then inherit the land that Naomi and Ruth themselves could not inherit, so that their line could continue. And Naomi sends Ruth to this man at night under dubious circumstances, which we will describe, and to try to get him to marry her. And he agrees and marries her, and they all live happily ever after. But that story doesn't sound terribly complicated, but there's very fascinating undertones in the story, specifically related to things like immigrants, illegal immigrants, and what do you do with a people you despise who become part of your lineage, and not only that, the lineage of your king, because the story actually ends with the genealogy of David, pointing out the fact that David the king, this is his great-grandmother. And then, of course, if you're a Christian, that means this is one of the ancestresses of Jesus Christ from the Christian faith. There are several key words that will play an important role in the story. The first is hesed, which is the term used to describe God. When it says God is loyal to his people and will not abandon his people, he is chesed, faithfulness. The other is Baruch, as in Baruch atah Adonai, blessed are you, Jehovah our God. It means to be blessed. And what we are doing is we're taking a people who are cursed, the Moabites, and making them blessed. And so both Ruth and Boaz are described as both chesed and Baruch, blessed. And so the story is about how Boaz, the man who marries Ruth, through his willingness to follow the law, becomes blessed, and how Ruth, a Moabite who is supposedly cursed, finds herself blessed through her hesed. There are allusions to several other biblical stories buried in the text. So to understand this text, you have to kind of know these other biblical stories that they make obtuse allusions to. They just assume you know them. So we're going to have to tell them first. Luckily, I've already told some of them, but that doesn't mean you've all heard all of them. So we're gonna try to overview them very quickly again. And the first story that plays a role is Lot and his daughters. Now, Lot is Lot of famous Sodom and Gomorrah fame or infamy. He's the guy who takes care of the angels and otherwise does a fairly decent job, but he just kind of tarries and kind of refuses to get out. And in the end, the angels almost have to kind of kick him out. So he gets out of Sodom and Gomorrah before it's destroyed by fire and brimstone. And of course, the destruction is so vast that Lot and his two daughters, the only one who escaped because his wife is killed she turns around and turns into a pillar of salt. Remember the story? So Lot and his two daughters are hiding in a cave, and they literally think they're the only people who've survived a worldwide apocalypse. And so the daughters say, hey, we got an idea. This is the end of humanity as we know it if we don't have children. And Lot, he's the only dude around, our father, he's the only dude around who can help us have children, so let's get him good and drunk, and while he's drunk, we'll go in one at a time and sleep with him. And out come Moab and another of the two nations, Ammon. Ammon and Moab are the two children. Ammon is from the father, Moab means from the father, And so Moab is literally born of her father. Now, Moab is one of those nations that Israel was constantly at war with. And if you can't beat your enemy, what do? Well, you tell salacious stories about their origin. So this is probably where this story comes from. This is the only way they can kind of strike back at the Moabites, right? By telling these horrible stories about the origin of their nation. But fascinatingly enough, the Moabites are Abraham's kin. So despite the fact that they're their enemy, despite the fact that they're cursed, they are Abraham's kin. It's a little bit out of order, but let's do this, and then we'll come back to Judah and tomorrow. This is from Deuteronomy 23, 4 through 5. It gives you an idea of how the Israelites felt about Ammon and Moab. An Amorite and a Moabite shall not enter into the assembly of the Lord, meaning the people of Israel, among other things. Even to the 10th generation shall none of them enter into the assembly of the Lord forever, because they met you not with bread and water when the way and when you came out of Egypt. So what's happening is Israel, let's go back to the map, is coming out of Egypt. And on their way out of Egypt, they're going this way to the promised land. And neither Ammon nor the kingdom of Moab would let them through. And so they had tussles with them during the Exodus story. So the story goes. And so God curses them because they hired against you. And then, to make matters worse, they hired this prophet. Do you remember the story of Balaam and the talking donkey, the mad prophet and the talking donkey? These are the people who hired this man to go curse Israel. And so because of that, you aren't supposed to marry them, and you aren't supposed to marry them to the 10th generation. And the 10th generation of anyone who does marry them is cursed. But David is the grandson of Ruth, who is a Moabite, ergo within 10 generations. So basically, David breaks the law. And Ruth is there to explain how that happens. This is one of the stories that you need to understand the story. The other is Judah and Tamar. If you're watching online, I will link to this lecture in the notes, but I gave a class, number 12 was on this subject. And Judah and Tamar is this story of how Judah has three sons, and he marries two of them off to this woman named Tamar, but they both die. And so he doesn't want to give her his third son, but by the law, he's supposed to give his third son to her so she can have progeny. And when he refuses, she dresses up like a prostitute, finds him along the way, and he has sex with her, thinking she's a prostitute because she's got a veil on her face apparently. And then he wanders off, and then later he finds out that his daughter-in-law is pregnant and he wants her put to death. And then she's like, yeah, but you're the dad. And he's like, oh, shoot. And then he has this line where he says, you've been more righteous than I. Judah and Tamar is an important story that will show up in direct reference in the Ruth story. So you have to know the Judah and Tamar story to make sense of what's happening in Ruth. The other one is the horrifying story in Ezra. In Ezra, the Israelites just came back from captivity in Babylon, and they read the law, and they find out that one of the things the law says is not only you're not supposed to marry Moabites, it says you're not supposed to marry anyone who is not an Israelite. And so if you have, you've broken the law. And so all the priests who have married other people put their wives and children away and send them off. They just kick them out. All their non-Israelite brides, they kick them out. Again, this story is fairly important for understanding Ruth, because Ruth flies again in the face of this story. And in fact, when we talk about here's the line. Let's just read it. Marrying foreign wives is forbidden in Exodus and Deuteronomy, and in Ezra we get this line. So now let us make a covenant with our God to send away all the wives and the children according to the counsel of our Lord from those who are trembled at the commandment of our God, and let them be done according to the law. Take action, for it is your duty, and we are with you. Be strong and do it. And all these that married foreign women, they sent them away with their children. And one has to wonder how these people took care of themselves after just being kicked out, especially in a culture where they're not allowed to own land or own property, and they're just exiled. It's a very callous act, and I would say a very immoral act. Ruth stands in the Bible in intentional contrast with that story. The other two laws you need to understand from the Old Testament are the Redeemer of blood and the law of levirate marriage. The Redeemer of blood is the person who, if your brother or is killed, murdered, you're supposed to avenge him by killing his killer. The other thing the Redeemer of blood is supposed to do is if your brother falls in hard times and loses his land, sells it because he's in trouble and he sells his land, or he sells himself into slavery because he's so poor, it's your job to earn enough money to buy that land back, because the land has to stay in the family. Jewish law is very, very concerned with this idea of keeping the land in the family and in the right families where it was given. This land was given as an inheritance from God, so you have to make sure that it stays in the family. That's the law of the Redeemer. The law of levirate marriage is similar. Because the land has to stay in the family, if your brother dies without a child, you are commanded to marry his widow and raise up a child. And by the way, his child, and that's not as horrible in the land of polygamy because you don't have to give up your wife, but you do have to marry his widow and make sure he has a child. And the idea here is that the child will inherit your brother's land, not you. You don't get to inherit, and your children, with your primary spouse, don't get to inherit. But his child stands as if it was the child of your brother and inherits in your brother's name. So you're like raising up a child to your brother who is dead. And this is the law of levirate marriage. The book is placed in the Hebrew Bible in the section called the writings. So the Hebrew Bible is divided into three parts. There's the law, the prophets, and the writings. And it's put in with the writings, whereas 1st and 2nd Kings is put in with the law. Samuel, and 1st, 2nd Kings is put in with the prophets. I'm saying this wrong. So 1st, 2nd Kings, Samuel is all part of the prophets. because it was written, it was, the prophets. I don't know why. It seems like a historical text to us, but it was put in this section with the prophets. But Ruth is over with the writings. In our Bible, Ruth shows up between, in the Greek translation Septuagint, and then later in our Bibles that we're familiar with, Ruth is put right between Judges and Samuel. And the reason it sits where it sits is because the events start within the days of the Judges. Okay, so after Judges. And it ends with the genealogy of David. And Samuel is about the prophet Samuel who anoints David king. And it's the rise of David is in Samuel. So we're going to put it kind of in between these two books where it goes historically. But it breaks up the Deuteronomistic history. The Deuteronomistic history seems to be compiled or written by a single author. It has a single theme almost to it. And the Deuteronomic historian wrote Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, and 1st, 2nd Kings. And Ruth is just stuck in the middle of the Deuteronomistic history. And it is clearly not written by the same people. In fact, it doesn't have the same theology, at least in the sense that Deuteronomistic history is very concerned with marrying people you're not supposed to marry. And Ruth is a counter to that narrative. And so now in our text, we have a counter to the narrative of the Deuteronomistic historian stuck in the middle of the Deuteronomistic historian's writings, which is fairly interesting in its own right. But when you put it where it goes in the Hebrew Bible, it goes with some of the wisdom literature, like Proverbs and Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, that sort of thing. Okay, when was it written? We do not know, but we can say that the text as we have it in front of us has a whole bunch of late Hebrewisms in it, so it looks late, probably around the time of Ezra. And that would make sense if someone around the time of Ezra watched these people being forced to put away wives that they loved and that loved them and sending them away because of some sort of almost a racial animus against people who are not Israelites. Someone wrote Ruth and said, "Nah," right? So it makes sense that it would be written about that time. But the other question should be not when was it written, but when was the story first told? Because this was an oral culture, and when the story was written is different from when stories started to be told. And we do not know the answer to that second question. But one theory is way back during the monarchy. And the reasoning here goes is that rumors were flying that David had foreign blood. Maybe he really did. And so if David had foreign blood, then the entire Israelite kingship lineage had foreign blood, and that would be a claim of illegitimacy. And Ruth would then stand as a text that says, yes, but she's a very special foreigner, and she was hesed, she was righteous, she was blessed, and she overcame kind of the curse of her people, and so this is why it's okay that David has foreign blood. I should point out that even in the stories in Samuel, David gets slapped with things that seem like inappropriate foreign connections. He hangs out with the Philistines and learns from them for a long time, and the Israelites might read that and go, this looks like impropriety, but the text is trying to explain why he was there and that it's not really improprietous, etc. So there's this sort of connection between David and foreigners that seems not just present in Ruth but elsewhere, and maybe Ruth was written to explain that away and turn it into a good thing. And maybe at least that's when stories like this started to be told, and they probably would have morphed as they were explained orally until by the time we get them and they're written down in Ezra. In Ezra's day, they're aimed very squarely at the things that Ezra was doing. By the way, I think this is really important for people who think the Bible is perfect and represents God's inerrant, perfected word and opinion on matters of how we should behave, and on any matter, in fact. Because here we have a law that David's family clearly breaks, and then we have an entire book of the Bible saying, see, isn't it wonderful? Right? So you could imagine something today. It would be almost like someone who likes to quote Leviticus to explain why gay marriage is wrong, and having an entire book of the Bible about this wonderful gay couple. That's the sort of, I want to put it in that modern terms because it gives you a feel for how subversive Ruth intentionally is. But it also clearly indicates that the Bible is written by different people with different opinions at very different times, and they did not all agree about questions like, what does it mean to marry Moabite? So this is why I think this text is so interesting. The other reason is it has and you know me, I love ritual, and I'm very interested in ancient ritual. Ruth is connected to the festivals of harvest. And so there's actually 5 books in the Bible that are read during Jewish festivals. Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther are all read during various Hebrew festivals. Ruth is one of these, and it's specifically read during Shavuot, which is Pentecost, the day of the giving of the law. That's how it's later interpreted, is a celebration of the giving of the law, but it is also an agricultural festival related to the harvest. I do not believe that they picked a story about harvesting and put it in as the festival of the harvest reading. I think rather the story was written as a play, maybe even, to celebrate the harvest. The harvest theme is woven throughout the text intentionally, as if it was written by somebody who wanted it to be a harvest story. So fertility and harvest are massive themes throughout the text, as well as almost ritualistic, almost sympathetic magic elements designed to celebrate the harvest so that you will have a good harvest, show how grateful you are for the great harvest last year, so that next year we'll also have fertility and great harvest, including children and the birth of children. Let's not forget the god El was originally a fertility deity, whereas Yahweh was originally a warrior deity, right? So if we go back to the evolution of monotheism and some of the lectures we've given on those. This is why we have these stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, all with wives who are barren, who suddenly miraculously bear children, because it's showing the power of the fertility of the God to grant fertility. And we have something similar here. So let's start. Like I said, this is only 4 small chapters, but very beautiful story. And we're going to read a lot of it. Not all of it. There's no time for all of it, but we're going to read a lot of it. So in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah — Bethlehem means the house of bread — Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. This is very much how the Israelites, remember, they wandered down into Egypt because there was a famine, only he's wandered into Moab because there was a famine. Where you really don't want to be. Moab is your enemy, and they're probably not going to treat you very well, which, again, the tables will be turned in a minute. But the name of the man was Elimelech. My God is king, that means. And his wife was named Naomi, pleasant. And the names of his 2 sons were Machlon and Kilian. And they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem. Ephrath is another name for Bethlehem. And so these are just another way of saying they're people from Bethlehem in Judah. And they went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. And they took Moabite wives. Now, what's a normal Israelite reading this going to think? That's against the law. Not just foreign wives, which was against the law, but Moabite wives, which is really against the law, cursed to the 10th generation, sort of against the law. And the name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And when they had lived there about 10 years, both Machlon and Kilian died also. So the women were left without their 2 sons and their husband. And her husband. Naomi was left without a husband. So let's talk for just a second about the names, because every name in this is symbolic or has meaning, and the names serve less about like who the person really was, but their role in the story. Bethlehem, the city of bread, and Ephrath, the other name for the place, is fruitful. Note, by the way, Bethlehem is where Jesus is supposedly from. And it's also King David's hometown, which is why the Messiah is supposed to be from from Bethlehem, sorry. Moab, from the father, of course, we've already talked about. Abimelech, my God is king. Naomi, blessed sweetness. Later she will say, don't call me Naomi, because God has dealt with me so horribly. Call me Mara. Mara means bitterness, and Mara is Mary, the mother of Jesus' name in the New Testament. Machlon means sickness, and Kilian means pining away or some sort of consumption, prefacing the fact that both of these people are going to die. I doubt that a mother would really name her child this, so it's probably just their role in the story more than their historical name. Orpah means the back of the neck. literally, so probably she who turns away and gives the back of the neck. This will foreshadow the fact that Orpah will not stay with Ruth. And then Ruth. Ruth is problematic because we know Ruth had meaning, but it's a little bit unclear what the etymology of Ruth is. They probably knew, but we've lost a little bit of our understanding, not being native speakers for so many hundreds of years. We think it means friend or companion, which would make a lot of sense. She's the friend of Naomi who stays with her faithfully. But it can also mean watering, maybe. I like that one because if we're talking about a famine, she's bringing water almost to Naomi's family and bringing forth new life to Naomi. And then Boaz, who we haven't met yet, he's the man who's going to step in and help. His name means strength or stability. We'll talk more about his name meaning in a little bit. But notice at this point in the story, we've had kind of, the first 5 verses, and we've introduced the main characters, and all of their names have a special meaning. And then, verse 8, I'm going to skip a little bit. Naomi decides to go home because now there's water and there's food again in Bethlehem, so she's going to go back to Bethlehem. But she says to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly." This is the first use of hesed. It's translated here kindly, but remember elsewhere it means with faithfulness to you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. You've been faithful to me and to your dead husbands. Go back I release you, go back and get married. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you, in the house of your husband. And she kissed them and they wept aloud. They don't have a husband, so she basically means go home to your mother. You're young enough, find a new husband. And if you go home, you have a shot at finding a new husband as a widow, and maybe you can have a life. But if you go with me, you have nothing. And so don't go with me, go home. The first one says, okay, and she leaves. And then, some more of her exposition, Naomi's speech. "No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you." There's the first use of this word bitter. Later she will say, "Call me bitter," because Mary, right? "For me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Why has the hand of the Lord turned against her? Well, we don't know. Remember, the book of Job is all about this, right? But the implication is because her sons married Moabites, and that's why they were both killed, right? That's what she would be thinking anyway. It's probably not true, as we will learn, but that's what she's thinking. We've sinned, we've married Moabites, and by the way, I can't take these Moabites into Israel because they're going to be despised there. And they're certainly not going to find a husband there because no one will marry them in Israel. They'll be cursed for the 10th generation. That's why she wants them to go home. And she thinks she's cursed to the Lord for marrying them in the first place. And then they wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. That's this picture here. Ruth clings to her mother-in-law and will not leave. Her mother-in-law seems to be fairly old. She mentions that she's old, and so if she goes back alone, there's worry about how she will take care of herself without someone young to help. And she says, "Go back to the people and your gods, return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, now here's this line, and it's in poetry. Some of the poetry is lost in translation, of course. But Ruth says, and she has these 2 stanzas of poetry, "Do not press me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." That line, "so and so to me," refers to some sort of a hand gesture. So if you've ever heard this before, "You cross my heart and hope to die, stick a needle in my eye," this sort of thing, this is what we're talking about, right? May the Lord do so and so to me. She's saying, may I be killed, may my life be taken. If and this prefaces a very old covenant formula, and one that is you still see in the penalties of Freemasonry today. But she's basically saying, I'd rather die than go back from you, and may the Lord kill me if I break this promise. So when Naomi saw that she was determined, that's one word for it, very determined, to go with her, she said no more to her and let her come. When she gets back, the people say, "Is this Naomi, the pleasant woman who left?" And she says, then she has several lines of poetry. "Call me no longer Naomi, call me Mara, for Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So they came to be at Bethlehem at the beginning, it says, of the barley harvest. Of course, this is a harvest festival story. So now we're in chapter 2. And it says Naomi had a kinsman whose name was Boaz. And Ruth, the Moabite, now Ruth is the instigator of this. In chapter 2, Ruth is the instigator, and later Naomi will be the instigator. But Ruth has this idea, and Ruth says, "Let me go into the field and glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose sight I may find favor." And she said, "Go, my daughter." So she went. What does she mean? So again, according to the law of Moses, you were forbidden to harvest the corners of your field, and anything you drop, you're supposed to leave for the widows and the orphans. This is not a religious commandment. This is a secular commandment. You were required to do this by the law, and this was the law of the land. And it was, a best way to describe this is as a social safety net. And so again, I have libertarian friends who are just convinced that taxation is theft and the Bible says so, and I wonder if they read the same book as me. Because this is a tax on the rich landowner to pay for welfare for the poor widows and orphans. That's what this is. And Naomi says, let me go make use of this. And also, by the way, for anyone who's traveling, and Jesus even has this great story where he's traveling and he's like, it's the Sabbath, and he picks some ears of corn. He doesn't ask, he just picks because he knows he can, because that's what it says you can do when you're traveling. He picks some corn and stuff, some grain from a field, random field, and starts to eat. And the Pharisees are mad at him because it's the Sabbath. They don't even bother to worry about whether he just stole from somebody. That's the law. He's allowed to do this, and Jesus makes use of it. So here we have the same story where Naomi is doing the same thing. And so she says she's going to glean behind someone who finds favor, and maybe that means she'll get some extra if he likes her, if he finds favor. And then it says, as it happened, she came to part of the field that belonged to Boaz, who the story has already told us earlier. Boaz is a near relative of Naomi's husband, dead husband. As it happened, the Bible is very clear to point this out, that this is a coincidence. And then it says, just then, again, another coincidence, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they said, "The Lord bless you." Here's another reference to this blessed thing. It's a repeated line throughout the text. And Boaz says to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "To whom does this young woman belong?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." Okay, so he notices her. I mean, the text is very clear that it never describes Ruth's appearance. Not once. Which is actually a little strange. A lot of people will say, "and she was fair." Now that's a very common, biblical sort of thing to say. She was a good-looking woman or whatever. They'll mention that in passing. They say nothing about Ruth's appearance. Not because she wasn't good-looking, it just doesn't tell us. Because Ruth's favor is found through her actions, not her appearance. And the text is trying to make that clear, I think. Which is, that's how we should judge people, right? Then Boaz says to his servant Sarge, "Who is this woman and where does she belong?" And he says she's from Moab. Now, notice, she shouldn't be here. Right? Not only is she an immigrant, she's in some ways what we would call today an illegal immigrant, because the Moabites aren't allowed to live with the Israelites. Everyone else, you're commanded to treat foreigners well because you were once a foreigner in Egypt. The law commands that. But it makes exceptions for Ammonites and Moabites. These people are not allowed. So she's not just an immigrant. I think this is very important for our day to understand. She's sort of an illegal immigrant. And there's several things he could do at this point, right? He could call ICE and have her deported. Or she intervenes and she says, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers. And she does so. And Boaz says to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter." He calls her a daughter, which may have something to do with Moab but anyway, he calls her his daughter. "Do not glean in another field or leave this one." Don't go anywhere else. Why not? Because it's not safe to go somewhere else. Stay here. We'll take care of you. But keep close to my young women, and keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped, and follow behind them. And I have ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. So you get to drink my water, you get to eat my food, and I'm going to keep you safe. And then she fell prostrate with her face on the ground and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight?" Notice what she says, that you should notice me when I am a foreigner. And Boaz answered, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before, specifically to help Naomi. And may the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. This is a reference to very old kind of religious iconography of the protection of God, imaged as these stretched out wings that provide shade from the sun. Again, a desert people. You may drink my water and rest under my shade, he says. Because you've come for protection from God, the least I can do is offer you some protection. This is a refugee story, and he's giving her protection. And so there's even more right after they eat, and all the story goes on with all the things Boaz does for her. You get the impression, by the way, that he has a bit of a crush by the end, possibly. But he goes out of his way to take care of this woman who's otherwise alone. And then she goes home, to her mother-in-law, and she brings a whole bunch of stuff that would take care of them for days. And her mother says, where have you gleaned today? Right? And where have you worked? Blessed is the man who took notice of you. See, there's that blessed again, another one of the themes of the book. And she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, the name of the man with whom I worked was this guy named Boaz. And her mother's like, I know him. Right? So her mother said to her daughter-in-law, blessed be he by the Lord, blessed be he, Baruch, be he of the Lord, whose kindness, hesed, and faithfulness has not forsaken the living or the dead. The man is a relative of ours and our nearest kinsman. She's not right, actually. He's not the nearest kinsman. We'll get to that in a minute. But the man who has a right to redeem our property. This is the man who, if our property falls on hard times and gets sold, he's supposed to buy it back for us. This is the man, by the way, who is supposed to marry you or me if my husband dies. But if I'm too old, marry you, because your husband has died. So the light of hope shines in her eyes, you can imagine, right? She's like, I've got an idea. She's got a plan. So the next chapter opens with Naomi's plan. And of course, welcome to the threshing floor plan. This is the notorious threshing floor plan. And I love this story to death. It's just got so many neat allusions and allegories in it and stuff. So Naomi says to her mother-in-law, my daughter, I need to seek some security for you so that it may be well with you, and with me, I might add. Now, because remember, they've lost their land. She can't inherit it. They need a man to go and inherit the land for them. This is the problem with this society. Now, here is our kinsman Boaz, whose young women you have been working with. See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Enter the threshing floor. Now wash and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor. Get pretty. But do not make yourself known to the men until he has finished eating and drinking. Wait till he's drunk. By the way, you're a Moabite, you know how to do this. Wait till he's drunk. This is an intentional allusion, by the way, to the Moabite story. And when he lies down, observe the place where he lies down, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And we have talked before about uncovering feet being a euphemism for uncovering genitals, but it's intentionally ambiguous. Ruth gets to decide what she means by that. But Naomi is very clear, I think, what she has in mind. Naomi is suggesting a seduction scene where Ruth is going to go in and seduce Boaz, get pregnant. Boaz will have to marry her because maybe she doesn't think Boaz will marry a Moabite without some sort of coercion. So she's suggesting a coercive course of action to get Boaz to marry her so that they can have posterity and seed and be safe. And then Ruth says, all you've said I will do. But remember, you can interpret what Naomi just said to her in several different ways. Let's talk for a minute about the threshing floor. There are sexual overtones throughout this story. They're obvious and they're clear and they're intended by the author. And by the way, if I've watched kind of fundamentalist conservative Christian scholars try to explain this story away because they're trying to defend modern sexual norms in a society that didn't care about those things. Remember, I've told you before, this society cares about procreation and about the integrity of the line of succession. That's why the story of Judah and Tamar is the way it is. They care about succession. And adultery is bad because it taints succession. You don't know who the father is, right? And then the wrong person could inherit. But inheritance law is what it's all about. And so these evangelicals bend over backwards to try to pretend that these overtones aren't here sometimes, and they are. And they're intended by the author. And by the way, when we get to what actually happens, it's ambiguous. I don't think anything happened, but you can't tell what actually happens when Ruth goes in there. And if the author had the same sexual mores as the modern conservative Christian evangelicals who are trying to explain this story away, the ambiguity would not have been put there on purpose. The ambiguity is intentional and placed there by the author, which implies that the author has a very different view of this than we do. By the way, threshing floors are associated with the activities of prostitutes elsewhere in the Old Testament. Specifically, I should add rituals of fertility in pagan worship around them. So ritualized prostitution happens at the threshing floor in order to ensure fertility. And this is a fertility story. So she's going to go to the threshing floor, and we're going to find out if fertility is possible. Again, it's intended. Several of the words have close sexual connotations here, like uncover, lay down, his feet. They can all have to do with sexual activity. Threshing floors are important ritual sites. Even in pagan rituals, this is a Greek description of the oracle at Delphi, where he describes it being built up like a threshing floor with a kind of omphalos navel in the center and a circular place for circumambulation, meaning to go around. All that is set up specifically because the ox go around with this sled, and that breaks apart the chaff, and then you throw it up in the air and the wind carries it off, and you end up with this pile of grain. It's associated with ritual. It's also associated with not just any ritual, but Israelite ritual at the Temple of Solomon, because King David purchased Arun's threshing floor on Mount Moriah, where he built an altar, offered sacrifice to avert an angel who was spreading plague everywhere. And this location later became the site of Solomon's temple, which was built at the same location where David had offered sacrifices at a threshing floor that he had purchased. The Holy of Holies of the temples, ancient Israelite temples, ancient before monotheism, were places of the bridegroom, the bridal chamber of Yahweh and his spouse, Asherah, in very old Hebrew texts. And then after monotheism takes hold, it's the bridal chamber of Yahweh and his spouse, Israel, where Israel and Yahweh meet, again, in the Holy of Holies of the temple. So there's all sorts of marriage, fertility overtones here. One more, Boaz's name. I told you we'd circle back to that one. I told you it meant strength, but I want to do it in a little more detail because it's really interesting here. Boaz is the name of one of the two pillars at the Temple of Solomon. We now know, by the way, that these pillars were probably not freestanding. They probably supported this porch. But in any event, the pillars had names. They were called Jachin and Boaz. Jachin means firm, upright, or stable. Boaz means strength, power, or might. And there is almost certainly something phallic going on in this reference, especially when you connect it with the threshing floor and a woman coming in to uncover the feet of a man who happens to be named Boaz. Reminds me, by the way, of the maypole, also related to fertility, harvest, that sort of thing. Spring. So Naomi is clearly suggesting a seduction, and it's related to this Moab story. We already covered that. So what happens when they actually go to the third? Well, I don't know. I wasn't there, but we can read what it says, and you kind of draw your own conclusions. Let's see. So she went down to the threshing floor. This is what happens when she gets there. And did just as her mother-in-law had instructed her to do, just as. When Boaz had eaten and drunk, and he was in a contented mood, he went in to lie down at the end of a heap of grain. And then she came stealthily and uncovered his feet and lay down. And by the way, this implies to me that she isn't uncovering his genitals, but just his feet. Again, it can be a euphemism from genitals, but the reason I think that is because he doesn't wake up. Now, maybe he's so slobbering drunk that he doesn't wake up, even when, but I doubt it, because of what happens next. I think she just uncovers his feet. Now, she's taking Naomi's, I think, and again, not because I'm trying to defend, modern morals, but just because I think I read the story, it seems to make sense that what she's done is she's taken a euphemism and interpreted it very literally on purpose and not done exactly what her mother-in-law suggested. And in other words, in this sense, she's breaking the cycle of what brought the curse, the Moabite, action. And at midnight, when the man was startled and he turned over, and there, lying at his feet, was a young woman. This is why I think she just uncovered his feet, right? He's asleep till he rolls over, and then he sees her there, and he's like, what? There's a woman here at my feet. What's going on? And he says, who are you? I think here he's asking, are you one of these? By the way, the other reason threshing floors are associated with prostitution is because the men are there working, and the women are gone, and they're away from home, and they're tired, and women probably come at night and offer their paid services. And so he's asking, who are you? Because how I treat you is going to depend on how you answer this question. Who is this random woman at my feet? And she answered, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are the next of kin. By the way, this comment, spread your cloak over me, is a request of marriage, but it also relates to that statement earlier about the God to spread his wings over you to protect you. She says, yes, God is protecting me, but now it's your turn. I want your protection because you are the next of kin. You have an obligation to redeem me, even though I'm a Moabite. So she's being very bold, given her Moabite ancestry. And he said, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. This last instance of your loyalty, Chesed, is better than the first. You have not gone after young men, whether rich or poor, and now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all that you have asked. And he's probably an older gentleman, but he is the next of kin. In other words, instead of her going home to her parents and finding a new young man to marry, she's going to marry the next of kin of her dead husband because she's being chesed, loyal to her dead husband, and she wants to raise up seed to him by marrying his next of kin, as the law requires. For all the assembly of my people know that you are a worthy woman. But now, though it is true that I am a near kinsman, there is another kinsman more closely related than I. Enter the problem. Right? This is the other reason why I think that the Hebrew law may not have cared about sexual impropriety in the same way we do, but they care a lot about this. And if there's a closer kinsman that Ruth and Naomi don't seem to know about, that's a problem, because if he has slept with her and then she's redeemed by this other person, the child might be from the wrong person, right? And that's something they care about. So he says, remain this night, and in the morning, if he will act next of kin for you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to act of next of kin for you, as the Lord lives, and again, an oath, just like Ruth's oath to Naomi, as the Lord lives, I will act as next of kin for you, lie down until the morning. So they spend the night together. And again, I think the implication is that nothing happened, specifically because Boaz is being portrayed as this righteous follower of the law, and this would be a problem, I think, from the law's perspective, if he slept with her knowing there was another nearer kin. Naomi and Ruth hatch this plan because they think he is the next of kin. He shuts the plan down, saying, because he is not the next of kin, but he says, we're going to make sure you're married. If the next of kin refuses, which he can do, then I'll take care of it, because you're going to be married. And there's a good chance he will refuse because she is a Moabite. So she stays with him, and then in the end, he gives her a bunch of grain and puts the seed in her cloak, and she carries it home. So literally, she returns home with again, this is what she came for. Right? In Hebrew, the seed and semen are the same word. She came for his seed, and she came home with his seed in her cloak. Different seed, though, because he gives her a whole bunch of barley grain and sends her home with it. Again, the reference is intentional, and it has to do with fertility. I mean, these people are not obsessed with sex. They're obsessed with fertility because their survival as a people depends upon fertility. And so all of this has to do with fertility and fertility references. Okay, so the next section, chapter 4, Boaz is now going to find out if this other person is going to marry Ruth. And by the way, the other person's name is not remembered. The Bible intentionally leaves his name out because he did not marry Ruth, and he does not deserve to be remembered. And Boaz's name will be remembered for time and all eternity, and his name is on the temple itself because he chose to marry Ruth. when this other man refused, is the implication of the story. So he goes, Boaz is very important, by the way. He goes here and he pulls up a whole bunch of witnesses and he gets the next of kin. He says, sit down, and the man sits down. Like he's giving orders and people are following his orders. So Boaz is a very important person and everyone is following his orders. And then it says in verse 3, he said to the next of kin, Naomi, who has come back from your country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to her kinsman Elimelech. They meet at the gate of the city, by the way, which is where these sort of transactions are carried out so that there can be lots of witnesses. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, so that I may know, for there is no prior to you to redeem it, and I come after you. Right? So what he's saying is, there's this widow, Naomi, and you're here next, her husband's next of kin, and their land is, not being controlled by someone else. It's your job to redeem it. Will you do it? And the man says, absolutely, I want this land. I'll redeem the land. And he says, I'll do it. And then Boaz says, the day you acquire the field from the hand of Naomi, you will also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead man, to maintain the dead man's name on the inheritance. Not only is this child that you're going to have with Ruth not yours, it's for this other person's name. She's a Moabite, by the way. And what does the man say? And the next of kin said, I cannot redeem it for myself without damage to my own inheritance, because my people would be cursed for 10 generations, yada, yada. Take the right of redemption yourself, or I can't do it. So Boaz says, okay. And he gives him his shoe, by the way, which is this fun reference. It says in the text, they took off the sandal and gave it to the other. They said that's what they did to kind of seal a deal. But it seems to me that that's like an old part of the story, and they've almost forgotten where it came from. What is far more likely is there's this line that says, if you go to someone and ask him to redeem you and you say no, the woman gets to spit in his face and take his shoe and smack him across the head with it. That's actually in the law. So the man who refused to redeem loses his shoe, which seems to be this reference to this penalty for failing to redeem that's down in the law somewhere. And by the way, the text of Ruth seems to not even itself understand the reference. And then Boaz says, today you are witness that I have acquired from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon, and have also acquired Ruth the Moabite for the wife of Mahlon, to be my wife, to maintain the dead man's name on his inheritance, in order that the name of the dead may not be cut off from this kindred and from the gate of the people. Today you are witnesses. And all the people were at the gate along the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord bless you. Now, this is what it seems like a play to me. There are choruses. There's a group of women who speak to Naomi and they act like a chorus, almost giving commentary, like a Greek chorus in a play. And here we have a bunch of men. This is the male section of the story, right? And the men get together and the men are acting as a chorus and they're blessing. Remember, the women kind of said, oh, you're dried up, we'll call you Naomi, and now you're Mara, and is this Naomi? That's the chorus line of the women. And now the chorus line of the men is, they bless Boaz for his faithfulness in marrying a Moabite. That is weird. But again, the text point is to criticize the way the law was interpreted by Ezra and Nehemiah and some of these other people, I think. And then it says, and though the children of the Lord will give you by this young woman, and through the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman, may your house be like the house of Pharez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. And now we have our overt reference to Judah and Tamar. There were non-overt references to it before this, right? The act of Ruth is very much like the act of Tamar, except she does it a little differently. She doesn't actually pretend to be someone else and seduce him. Rather, she tells him who she is. That's what Tamar didn't do. And asks him to marry her. And instead, Tamar tricks him into giving her seed. And Ruth asks for it, and he accepts. There's a lot more consent going on here than the Tamar story. All right. And then we get the theme, and then Boaz took Ruth, became his wife. They came together, the Lord blessed them, and they conceived, and they bore a son. And the women said to Naomi, so now the chorus of women are back. So they get to kind of close out the story. Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life, to bring life back to the dead. This is the fertility references. And a nourisher of your old age for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons. has borne him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. I don't know if that means she actually, in her old age, gave milk. That's entirely possible. This is a fertility story. But it also may just mean she took care of him. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi," and they named him Obed. And he became the father of Jesse, the father of David. And then the story breaks into genealogy mode for the last two verses. Now these are the descendants of Pharez. Pharez, remember who Pharez is? Pharez is the son of Judah through the woman his daughter-in-law who dresses up like a harlot and is Tamar. So we start with this story of Judah and Tamar, and we're going to work our way back. Pharez became the father of Hezron, Hezron of Ram, Ram of Aminadab, Abinadab of Nashashon, Nashashon of Salmon, and Salmon of Boaz, Boaz of Obed, Obed of Jesse, and Jesse of David. And then, of course, if you're a Christian, ... this goes down to all the way to the descendants of Jesus Christ. So again, I think this is would have served as a very sort of powerful refutation for those who said David isn't worthy to be our king because he had married, he had a Moabite in his ancestry. But even so, what we're trying to do, what the text is trying to do in that sense, is to establish an exception to the law. Because the law is clear. And what the story is saying is, yeah, but there are exceptions. And we should judge kind of each instance on its own merits and each person on their own merits instead of just blindly, legalistically following the law. I think that's very powerful. The other thing the story is almost certainly doing is pointing at the people of Ezra who threw away their foreign wives because the law commanded it. And by the way, why did the law command that? The law makes it clear what the reasoning is. Whether that's a good reason or not, it says if you marry non-Israelites, you will probably worship non-Israelite women, or the gods of these non-Israelites. They will bring foreign worship in, and you won't stay true to your worship of me. And so your commitment to me as God and to monotheism itself is put into question if you marry outside the covenant. But remember Ruth's comment earlier, your God will be my God, your people my people. Where you die, I will die. Where you are buried, I will be buried. It's also interesting that the Jewish people choose to read this during the feast that celebrates the giving of the law, because this is interpreted as a story of conversion. That a person who was outside the law took the law upon themselves and agreed to follow the law, and thus became an Israelite. Like, she is no longer a Moabite; she is an Israelite. This story is powerfully subversive to people who want to set up insider-outsider boundaries and make those boundaries firm. The danger is the story is interpreted, I think, that, well, Ruth is exceptional, right? Ruth gets away with it because look at all the great things Ruth did. She exhibited hesed, and therefore she was barach, blessed. But in reality, anyone can exhibit hesed and then deserves to be blessed. And again, that's the subversive power, I think, of the story. So I hope that what we have shared today helps you on your life's journey. I hope to see you next time. And are there any burning comments, questions before we quit? And then I'll show you some additional reading. No? Thank you. Thank you all for coming. If you're interested in more on Ruth, episode 2, I always recommend at least one Bible for Normal People episode on all these. But episode 253, the book of Ruth, with Reverend Dr. Judy, I'm going to slaughter her name, Fenentras Williams, is amazing. She talks about a lot of these themes, especially this whole concept of the other. Especially as an African American, she has some important, I think, insights into that theme. The Oxford Annotated Bible, the 5th edition, had great footnotes on all the meaning of the names, because the names are meaningful, and if you don't know the meaning of the names, then you miss some of the undercurrents of the story. So its introduction and its footnotes are incredibly useful. The Anchor Bible Commentary, I recommend these for every book of Scripture. It has a section on Ruth. I highly recommend it, and the only problem is they're very, very expensive, but if you can find one in a library. And then upcoming topics. I'm going to put the Bible, this is a good stopping place because we've interrupted the Deuteronomistic history anyway. So I'm going to jump to comparative religion for a minute. We need to do Islam. So we're going to do Islam next time. I've given a course on Islam a long time ago, but it was before I was recording these, so there isn't one online, and it was, like I said, it was a long time ago. So I need to redo that subject, put that online for people. It's a religion that has a major section of the world's population that belongs to it, and it deserves to be talked about. But I also want to then do, instead of discussing each religion, one religion at a time, and then hoping you can see how it relates to modern traditions, I want to just take a concept like how Jesus came to be believed as divine, whether you believe that's true or not. There's a context around it that impacts the words that they use to describe Jesus' divinity. So if you believe it's a cultural concept, then the cultural context matters. If you believe he really is the Son of God, then the cultural context still matters, whatever you believe, because that impacts how they talked about it. So I'd really like to talk about how Jesus became God and the history of that idea. Instead of each religion, I want to take all the religions and just kind of point out each piece that is similar and how they kind of evolved into this concept through time. I also love to do one on how Satan became the devil. So I think those are kind of the next three classes. I'd also really like to circle back to some religious studies topics because I'd like to discuss how scientists study religion. As if you take religion as a field of study, how do you study it? I don't mean like studying the divine. I mean studying the religious feelings people have, the religious things people do. How do you study religion as a psychology subject or as a sociology subject? And I'd also like to talk about how the West invented the concept of religion itself, which biases everything we do when we study religion, because that is not a concept other people's or even our people historically have had, is religion as its own category or concept. So I'd like to circle back on how we invented religion and how we study religion as kind of scientists. So that's kind of a roadmap for the next year, at least, of classes. I only do one of these a month. So 3 comparative religion courses and at least 3. There's probably be 2 on Islam. We'll probably take 2 to do Islam. So at least 3 there, maybe 4 or 5, and then several on religious studies. And then we'll circle back to the Bible and we'll do Samuel, and we'll start talking about King David, finally. And that'll probably be a couple years from now at the rate I'm going. But that's the roadmap for what's coming. Again, thank you so much for being here, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you.